Thanks, Simon. It's nice to be at the 9 o'clock. I haven't been here for a while. Some of you are new faces for me, which is great to see. Some of you know all too well what it's like to have me up at the front and preaching. But it's good to be here, and thanks for the prayer. Simon asked me to talk this morning about, as the title in the pew sheet and in the roster says, making space for God's grace and God's judgment and holding those two together. And I want to talk about that. I think that's a really cool and important topic for us to think about in relation to this story of Jesus that as he meets this woman at the well. So we're in this season of Lent, and I guess you're all well aware of that season of the church year when we're walking towards Good Friday, or Bad Friday, whichever way you want to look at it, our worst Friday and God's best Friday, or something like that. And it's traditionally a season where we are taking stock, and sometimes we give things up in order to kind of fast and to take the concentration that gives us and focus it on walking more closely with God. And I think this story sits really well with Lent. I'm glad Simon's doing this and we're walking through it. The woman and Jesus and the well and the town and the disciples and various other things. So just a quick reminder. It's a simple situation, isn't it, this story? We started sort of halfway through this morning where Jesus says to the woman about the fact that she's been married a few times and she's now with someone that she's not married to and all that jazz. But really it just begins with Jesus sitting by a well and a woman turning up in the middle of the day and him saying, "Can you give me a drink?" But of course there's all these layers that we've been exposed to so far, that she's a Samaritan woman and Jews don't normally have anything to do with Samaritans, let alone drink from the same drinking vessel and all this kind of stuff. But it's actually a simple situation that leads to this profound connection. And Jesus ends up staying for 2 days in that town that he didn't plan to stay in at all, because something's going on here. There's a deep connection takes place. There's conversation about a drink, about living water, about husbands. There's some avoidance goes on. "Oh, I see you're a prophet. I've got my prime question to give to a prophet, so I don't have to talk about anything real. Now, should we worship on this mountain or in Jerusalem?" "Yeah, right," says Jesus. "The Father looks for people who will worship in spirit and in truth. And it's not going to matter whether it's this mountain or it's Jerusalem or it's Nelson or wherever." And then she starts to realize, because Jesus tells her, and somehow she believes him, that she's in the presence of the Messiah. There's some stuff to be careful of in all there, and I'm not going to go on about that now, but this lady and her multiple husbands and all the rest of it, it becomes a bit typical, doesn't it? Sounds like the church. We're concerned about how many husbands and wives people have had, and we pick on women especially. Where is the husband anyway? And all this kind of stuff. But I'm just going to put that to one side, because that's not what Jesus is doing here. And we're going to move on. It all comes to this place, doesn't it? Where she runs into the town. I mean, it doesn't say she runs, but she leaves her water jar and she goes back to the town. So presumably she was in a hurry. And she says, "Come see the man who told me everything I have ever done. Come meet this guy who just laid it all out." But I'd like you to, I'm going to break the rules. You're going to have to talk to each other for a moment. Talk to the person next to you, or if you don't like the person next to you, get up and move and talk to somebody else. How do you think you would feel to meet someone who told you everything you had ever done? How would that feel? Just a quick chat. I know you're 9 o'clockers, but you can do it. All right, any thoughts? Simon had a little chat to himself, but he does that a lot, so it's okay. Any thoughts? Just very quickly. You'd want to run away. Yeah. Thank you, Annie. Yeah, embarrassed, someone said at the front.
Jesus must have spoken to her about more things than just her husband.
Well, you'd think. Yep, could be. I mean, we always, in all these stories, I think we get kind of a précis, you know, like a distillation down, don't we? I suspect there was more chat. I think you're right. But on the other hand, that phrase just sort of captures a sense of something, doesn't it? That he put his finger on who she is and what her life has been like and just kind of connected it all up in that way, and she just felt completely known. And I think probably in the chat around the room, many of you would have felt, as we've just had, you know, embarrassed or I want to run away. If somebody walked in here and started saying all the things that I've ever done, I just want to run a very long way away. And yet that's not how she's seeing it, is it? So why does Jesus say this to her, you know? Why does he say to her this moment? Because Jesus initiates this conversation about husbands and things. She's talking to him and he says, go and call your husband and come back. And he knows she doesn't have one, and he knows all this stuff, and that she's with someone who's not her husband. Why does Jesus say this to her? Why does he do this? Does he want to expose her? Does he want to embarrass her? Is he just taking her down? Ha ha, lady, I know all about you. No, that's not how it pans out, is it? That's not what Jesus is doing. So why? Why does he do this? Well, he's telling her, isn't he, that he really does know her. That he knows some stuff about her. But when she runs back and she says, come and meet this man, come and see this man, we're seeing something, aren't we? That somehow in this judgment that he utters, and you may not think this is judgment, but I reckon it is, so we're going to talk about it in a minute, she's safe. Why do I call it judgment? Because he doesn't say you are condemned because your life is out of shape or you've mucked up. He doesn't say that. He doesn't condemn her at all as far as I can see. He doesn't condemn her, but the truth is told. The facts are given. And that's judgment, isn't it? If I'm in a dispute with somebody and we go to the court to receive a judgment, then that's really about the facts being stated, the truth being told, and then, okay, some kind of decision is made. But it doesn't have to be a condemnation. In fact, you can go to the courts, should be quiet because there's lawyers in the room, but you can go to courts for something called a declaratory judgment. Anyone heard of one of those? Declaratory judgment, where you go and you present the facts of a case, wanting to know what the court would rule in this situation. Right? It's not really about one person winning or one person losing. It's just finding out what the situation is, getting it declared. Jesus speaks the truth with this woman, and it's not kind of padded out. It's just what it is. But in that space of this utter truth-telling, she's actually safe. The facts are given, the truth is told, and it's actually in grace. It's in a welcome and an offer of life. Jesus is the one who's here with her saying, if you knew who you were talking to, you'd ask him and he'd give you living water that would well up and give you life, eternal life. Jesus is speaking to her about this amazing offer of life from God. It's all grace, but in that place, the truth is told. Now, what happens here? Well, you've probably got plenty of thoughts in your minds about that, but here's a couple of thoughts of mine. She doesn't just meet law, she meets the lawgiver. She doesn't just meet rules or rights and wrongs, she meets the source. And she doesn't just meet judgment, she meets the judge. She meets the one whose judgment, whose truth actually saves. When he speaks to her about her history, you almost get the sense, don't you, that when she wants to run back and tell everyone about him, that there's freedom for her here somehow. That she's released somehow. I mean, it doesn't say that, does it? But if you look at it, you think, well, wow, here's this woman, and we know, because it tells us, that she's come in the middle of the day to the well when you don't go to the well. And that's been covered in our series before. She's probably, pretty much certainly, a bit of an outcast in her society because her life doesn't fit. And that's why she's at the well at that time of day, not with the other ladies earlier in the day. And yet she runs back to the town and advertises herself. Come see the man who told me everything I've ever done. Yeah, well, we know everything you've ever done. Yeah, you know. She actually, have you ever noticed that and thought? When she runs back to the town, she exposes herself. The woman who doesn't go to the well with the rest of the woman runs back to the town and says, come on everybody, meet this guy. There's something extraordinary happens for her, isn't there? And it doesn't happen through any kind of pretense or fudging or lying or hiding. It happens because Jesus knows her completely, and in that place he loves her. He tells the truth, but she is saved. Now, it's a bold claim. It doesn't tell us that she's saved, but there's something going on here that I'm calling salvation. I'm sure of it. Wow. Now, I want to say, Burgess' big, bold theological claim for the day, there is no deeper meeting with Jesus without this. There's just no way of meeting Jesus without this. I mean, people meet Jesus, but those deeper meetings where people encounter the Messiah, the Savior, there's always something of this going on, and it's true for us. There's no transformation of our lives. There's no real salvation. There's no being changed without this. Simon was talking to us last week about change and God bringing change and how it's uncomfortable. There is no change in us. There's no transformation of us into God's image, no being made new without this judgment of God's grace. There's no grace except the grace of God, which also judges. Now, you might think I'm a bit weird to say that, but actually it makes perfect sense. See, I think God's grace works a little bit like this. And so I think it's what happens with this woman. God speaks to us and claims us and says, you're mine. And actually the depth of that is God says, there's no part of you that isn't mine. There's no past of yours that I'm not claiming. There's no future that you have where you're not mine. There's no future that you can have where I'm not claiming you. Everything you are, everything you have, everything you've done, everything you will be, you're mine. And in that space, God says, I love you. I claim you because I love you. And the depth of that claim and the whole meaning of this season of Lent is expressed, isn't it, on the cross. Where does God claim us? How does God claim us? Actually, fully and totally in dying for us. In the putting to death of everything that destroys us. In the nailing to that tree, to that cross of wood, of all of our sin. You know, and we're confused about sin. We think sin is just naughty things we've done. But sin is actually everything that gets between God's purpose for us and us. It's all the social pressures. It's all of our history. It's all of our guilt. It's all of our misunderstandings, our habits of thought, our habits of behavior. They really go together, don't they? What we think we do. All of that stuff. It's all nailed to the cross in Jesus, where he claims us completely. And this grace says, I will not let you go down that hole. I will not leave you where you are. I will not accept that that's just who you are. And where we would continue to give up and just kind of live in a space where life is what it is and our future is just what it is, God refuses to allow that and says, I'm putting that to death and I'm claiming you. Now that's the judgment of God's grace. But it's quite full on, isn't it? Because God does tell us everything we've ever done. And tells it like it is, and does actually judge it. There's no grace except this grace which claims us so deeply. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a very famous theologian. He was also very famous for his opposition to Hitler in World War II, but he wrote about costly grace and cheap grace, and many of you already know this. That there's this thing, cheap grace, where we think that God just meets us and says, there, it's okay, I love you, it's all right, don't worry. And we stop at that point. That's cheap. It doesn't cost me anything. Doesn't involve any challenge particularly, but actually Bonhoeffer was right when he said that's not grace at all. That's just a let-off. That's nothing. It doesn't do anything. God's grace is real grace because it costs us everything and gives us even more. God's grace judges all that is mistaken, all that is wrong, in order to bring all that is true and all that is right. Now, we don't really hear much anything more about this woman or her town after this story, do we? But we could ask ourselves this question: is Jesus' work complete among them? I've got complete twice in that sentence, that's all wrong. Let's judge that. Is Jesus' work complete among them when Jesus moves on after 2 days? Well, clearly not. It's just not enough, is it? But we could remind ourselves that one of the first places the gospel goes after Jerusalem and the witness of Jesus' resurrection is Samaria. And we know that this village will have been visited by those who are witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, and they will have talked in this place about him. You just think about it. Wouldn't that be extraordinary? They've met Jesus. He's stayed with them 2 days, and then later on, they hear about what's happened. Wouldn't that complete the picture and keep them going? I think so. And they will go on. So what about us? What about us? Well, we know the judge, don't we? It's not just about laws or rules or fear of judgment, is it? Will I make it to heaven? Or on Judgment Day, will I be able to somehow get away with what I've done? Or will there be some kind of, have I done enough to balance it out? We know the judge, who is the healer and is the Lord. Knowing the judge doesn't mean getting let off, does it? But it means we know the one who saves us in judging. To be a Christian, I think, is to accept that we are already judged and our sin is dealt with. Now, does that sound strange to you? Because for most of us, we think to be a Christian is to avoid judgment. You see, I think that when we understand that Jesus was nailed to the cross to deal with our sin and our brokenness and to make us whole, then we understand that when Jesus was nailed to the cross, we were already judged and we are raised to life anew in him. So, at its kind of baldest, maybe to be a Christian, among many words that we hear from the Lord, is to understand this. Jesus says to us, you are a sinner, and you're messed up, and I'm dying for you. And we just have to say, okay. Yes, you're right. That's why we have confession every week in our services. Not just so that we can make a little list of the little things that we have or haven't done this week, or the great big things. I don't know about you guys. Mine are tiny little sins, you know. It's not just some exercise in, oh, okay, that's right, I've got to dredge up a few things again. What have I done? It's that recognition that to be a Christian is to be a forgiven sinner. And forgiveness means that my sin is judged, but I am raised up through it. I know the judge, and he loves me. He tells the truth. He condemns my sin, and in doing so, he saves me. And here is change. Here is transformation. Here is what it really means to be a disciple. That daily we die to all that is messed up and all that is wrong and all the power of darkness that surrounds us in this world. And we rise, we are lifted up. We choose, because we are commanded, to follow God's way. We choose to be transformed. We embrace what God is doing. That's deep discipleship. And so the community of the church is this community, isn't it? Kind of living inside of the judging grace of God. Living inside of the truth-telling and the transformation that God brings to us day by day by day. And this is the basis of our life, our service, our outreach, because we do not belong to ourselves anymore. We cannot. We belong to the one who told us everything we ever did, and in doing so freed us. Who died so that in him we too can die and live. Let's pray.